very early on, obviously in the book of Matthew, in the book of Mark, Christ himself draws a distinction between what we today would call the church and the state. Now, for a distinction to be drawn between the church and the state in the ancient world, that in itself was something of a revolution, because as ancient historians will say, in the ancient world, and this was pretty common in ancient cultures, there really was no there was no distinction really between what we would call religion and politics. It was all sort of intertwined. Very often rulers performed the tasks of priests and rulers were worshipped as gods, whereas Jesus says, no, these two terms are to be distinguished. So that in itself was very important. But in the medieval period, what the Roman Catholic theologians do is that they take some ideas that are kind of around there in the ancient world, particularly from the Stoics, this idea of a natural law, sort of a law that is above governments and not necessarily created by human beings. And they really develop it in a fine philosophical way and really make completely standard during the Middle Ages the idea that in actual fact there are moral principles that are above the state. And so early Christianity and medieval Christianity suddenly makes totalitarianism absolutely impossible in a way that it wasn't really impossible in the Roman Empire, because it essentially says that there are limits to what rulers can do, and those limits are contained in the natural law, the law of God, and even there's an earthly institution that can hold a ruler accountable, and that is the church. That is a massive change in politics in history. And then when you go to the Reformation period, the Protestant Christians took some of the ideas, again, of medieval Catholic Christians on the notion of legitimate political rule by the consent of people who are ruled, and notions that individuals have individual rights. These were things developed by Catholics, and the Protestants emphasized these things even more, particularly the Puritan Protestants, who had a very heavy emphasis on the notion that government is only legitimate if it has the consent of the subjects. And they base that to a large extent actually on their reading of the Bible and their reading of the New Testament and the way that they believed the church was organized, which is essentially congregations electing their own pastors. And this Puritan tradition had a tremendous impact on the first sort of great figure of modern liberal democracy, John Locke. John Locke writes his 2 treatises of government, where he bases his ideas of property rights and his ideas of government by consent on the idea that we are created in the image of God and we're God's property. And so all of this is a massive revolution compared to how people in the ancient world tended to think. In the ancient world, justice was often just used as a synonym for power. And the classic example of that is the Melian dialogue in 416 BC, where the Athenians basically say to the island of Melos, join us or we'll absolutely destroy you. And the Melians say, well, what about justice? And the Athenians say to the Melians, this is what justice is, that the strong will do what they can and the weak will suffer what they must. That was a very commonly accepted understanding of justice in the ancient world. The reason it becomes a minority view of justice and nowadays is seen as the very opposite of justice is because of the Christian influence. And of course, Tom Holland writes a lot about this sort of thing in his book Dominion. But the fact that we have justifications for democracy today that say all people are equal, the fact that we believe for the most part that utopian projects will only result in destruction is because humans are intrinsically flawed. These are very much, I would say, gifts actually of Christianity throughout the ages.
I was once struck by a neat little, what I thought was a piece of writing by an American. We're so good we had to give ourselves the vote, we're so bad we had to give ourselves the vote. And it's a reference to the nobility of the individual, Pascal might have put it. Man is the most noble thing in the universe, but he's also the scum of the universe, capable of being both.
Yeah.
So we had to give ourselves a vote because everyone should have a say in where the society goes, should authorise the government, but then because people that you elect to power are corruptible, they become lazy, they become self-centred, you've got to give them the people of power to remove them.
Well, that reminds me of a very famous quote from the American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. I think it was from his book, The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, which is itself, of course, a quote from the New Testament. And the quote is something like this, and I don't think anyone said it any better, but I'll use the masculine language of the original quote, but man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's tendency to injustice makes democracy necessary. And so if everyone was just mere demons with no capacity to do anything good, democracy would immediately fall into mob rule and warfare. And the Greeks themselves had a word for mob rule, ochlocracy. Having said that though, we do have a capacity to treat one another justly, and yet we have a tendency not to, which means that we have to hold one another account as well. And historically, what we've found is that the best way to hold one another to account is through democratic procedure. And so the unique, I think, contribution that Christianity brings to democracy is a very powerful justification for democracy, and it is essentially that democracy is the best way to keep other people's sin in check, and at the same time the best way to honour the dignity in other human beings. And I think historically that has actually proven to be, that's proven to bear fruit. When you look at the countries in the world where people most want to live, they are democracies with a strong Christian heritage as well.
Now, many people in those democracies, in our culture today, many of yours and my friends would say, oh, no, you've got that all wrong. It was the Enlightenment that gave us freedom. Yeah. It wasn't the Reformation, it wasn't religion. They were all always fighting one another. It resulted in tensions in war. It had to be brought to an end. The Enlightenment was us growing out of religious conflict and warfare, and that's what's provided us with contrast. Your response?
I think it's horribly simplistic, because what people forget is that as the Enlightenment is taking place, particularly through the 18th century, there's another huge event that is taking place at the same time, and that is the evangelical revivals. And so when we talk about everything that's going on in the 18th century, which we sort of call the Enlightenment century, we have to take into account that it is not just sort of Enlightenment ideas of reason that are forming the way that people think and shaping institutions and social changes that are taking place, but also evangelical Christianity. And the obvious example of this is, of course, someone like William Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery. But it's so important to remember that again, most Enlightenment thinkers were not atheists. Most Enlightenment thinkers did really believe that God is necessary for any sort of coherent moral theory. There were some who did not believe that. So there are people like, for example, Jeremy Bentham and some of the French philosophes who did not believe that. But those people tended not to be the mainstream thinkers. The more mainstream thinkers in the Enlightenment, someone like, for example, in England, a guy named William Paley, who had a famous argument for the existence of God based on the idea if you were walking down the beach and you came across something that seemed to tell the time, what is the best way to understand where that thing came from? Did it come together by chance through random forces of nature, or was it designed? Well, how much more complex is the universe to a clock, so how much more ought we think that the universe is designed? That's William Paley, who was one of the most influential Enlightenment thinkers of the British tradition. And when William Paley believed strongly in reason, but he believed that reason supported Christianity and that it even supported an established church. The point that I want to make is that, yeah, the Enlightenment period was absolutely seminal in bringing about many modern notions of freedom and many modern political practices such as modern democracy, which in many ways the thought about modern democracy predates the Enlightenment to many Puritans, I should just say. But again, the problem is when people characterize the Enlightenment as some kind of secular, anti-religious process that took place. To some extent, that is the case of the Enlightenment in France. But the French Enlightenment was quite unique for the age, and many other countries looked at the French experiment with kind of horror, being horrified that they pulled down the church, being horrified that some of the French philosophes declared no God. The more mainstream expressions of the Enlightenment were more like the British Enlightenment, which said, okay, we don't want to base our social institutions and our social practices on superstition and oppression, by which they generally meant Roman Catholicism. But we believe that there are reasonable expressions of Christianity, most Enlightenment thinkers thought. John Locke himself, an early Enlightenment thinker, wrote a whole book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. And much of the British Enlightenment and the German Enlightenment, and I would say the American Enlightenment, was an attempt to, in a sense, restate many Christian moral principles on grounds that they considered to be reasonable and rational. But that, to the Enlightenment mind, did not necessarily mean anti-religious.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.